Democratic Party.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, it's my pleasure to rise in my place on behalf of my party, the New Democratic Party, and my constituents in Halifax-Needham, in North End Halifax and central and west parts of our capital city. Mr. Speaker, as you know and members here know, the address and reply is an opportunity for members to reflect on why and how we came to this place, who supported us in that journey, and what our experience has been here, as well as looking forward to what the aspirations of the government are and whether or not they meet the needs of the people in the province. And Mr. Speaker, as we were getting ready for this session, I noticed that the Chronicle Herald had run a very timely column by Chantal Hébert. In her column, she was commenting on two recent books on politics that had been published. And she said that any reasonable person who had looked at these books would think twice about getting into the trade. Well, Mr. Speaker, it's been 30 years since I got into this trade, and I like to think I'm a reasonable person most of the time. And Mr. Speaker, when I look back, I think I became involved in this trade 30 years ago, 1984, when I ran against two very seasoned politicians, well-respected former mayors in the city of Halifax, and I came a surprising second in that campaign. I used to tell people it was a real horse race, me and two old mares. And the campaign certainly was a lot of fun. Although we lost, the results were exhilarating for New Democrats in the North End of Halifax. And I say we, Mr. Speaker, because I really don't know of anyone who gets into this chamber simply because of their own brilliance, charm, or tenacity. Mr. Speaker, we get here through the hard work and the support of others, including our family, our friends, our constituents, often our co-workers, and we get here through the hard work of our party and its leader and the team he or she has around them. And Mr. Speaker, I want to stand in defense of a political party system and say that political parties are important in our system, not only for the choice it offers citizens in terms of finding the place that they're comfortable with respect to the values and beliefs that they hold dear, but political parties are important because, Mr. Speaker, very few people individually have the resources to engage in this trade alone. The thousands of dollars it takes to communicate with citizens, Mr. Speaker, is something that requires more than individual wealth. And as I look around this chamber, I don't see too many people here who have the private wealth to be able to engage as individuals to come here and do the work that we do. Mr. Speaker, back in 1984, I certainly had thought carefully about being a candidate and an NDP candidate. I, like many people here, wanted to change the world. and I wanted to help change Nova Scotia. I had worked in a legal aid clinic and in a community health centre. And Mr. Speaker, that work reflected my commitment to social and economic equality for women, for minorities, and for those who had and have no voice in the halls of power. And Mr. Speaker, it was rewarding and inspiring to work with North End residents, to overcome legal injustice and to prevent the bad health that is so closely associated with living in poverty. But frankly, Mr. Speaker, my community work, often done case by case, showed me the limits to what can be achieved through the practice of poverty law and the operation of community-based services. Mr. Speaker, I was very fortunate to go on to work in the media, where probably the highlight of my work with our national broadcaster was when I got to work with Hannah Gardner at the Fifth Estate on a piece that won many awards and saw the removal of Judge Raymond Bartlett from the bench in Nova Scotia after years of berating abused and battered women from his bench. So, Mr. Speaker, after 2 unsuccessful attempts at being elected in the North End of Halifax, I was successful in 1998. And Mr. Speaker, I have to say that the almost 17 years that I've spent now in this chamber have been anything but bleak in terms of my view of politics. Mr. Speaker, and I would say that that is probably true for almost all, if not all, of my colleagues, regardless of party in this chamber. Mr. Speaker, I feel a great sense of accomplishment because I got into politics. And yes, Mr. Speaker, some days are infuriating, and I'm sure there'll be a few of them infuriating in the next little while. But those days don't define the experience for me or for most of us here. Politics, by definition, is a collective experience. And elections are a collective decision. Political parties and political caucuses are a collective undertaking. And Mr. Speaker, when people work together and they decide together democratically, we truly can change the world. So being an MLA, a municipal councillor, an elected member of a school board, or a member of parliament is important. And Mr. Speaker, it's a public service rather than serving a private interest or a public goal, or at least that's how it's supposed to be. Mr. Speaker, as an opposition MLA, I've learned that public service by the opposition is not just about questioning, slowing, stopping, or discrediting the worst of what a government proposes. In opposition, we New Democrats were very proud, Mr. Speaker, of the long-term care campaign led by Darrell Dexter. He first recognized the injustice when constituents took their cases to him, and he took the issue first to an NDP convention, and then we New Democrats took it to the people. And we were able to reverse from opposition a policy adopted by the Liberals and enforced by the Conservatives, but working together in a spirit of public service, we were able to stop the impoverishment of seniors and others who needed long-term care. Mr. Speaker, when New Democrats campaigned against skyrocketing auto insurance rates, we had again taken what we heard from our constituents. And from opposition, we proposed the best and most enduring solution, and we created enough political pressure to drive rates down. So, Mr. Speaker, I have learned how in our political system, even an opposition MLA can change people's lives for the better. The Protection of Persons in Care legislation, a private member's bill that I introduced, had arisen from cases that touched the hearts and minds of my NDP colleagues and myself. We did the research, the legislation was developed through caucus solidarity, and the Conservatives were big enough to support its enactment. I never expected that I would be the Minister of Health as that legislation first took effect and began to change the way Nova Scotians protect persons in care. I always knew it was adopted, though, because we have a political system that works, and because I was never on my own in seeking that protection for very vulnerable citizens. And I want to take a moment to recognize a former member of this chamber, Ron Russell, who was instrumental in having the government of the day support that private member's bill. So, Mr. Speaker, the public often don't see necessarily the times that there is a lot of cooperation between political parties in this chamber, and how this chamber can actually, through that process of cooperation, get great results that make a difference in people's lives. And I have many examples from all parties represented here of where we have worked together. But, Mr. Speaker, it isn't only about cooperation. We do have a system that is predicated on the belief and the assumption that politics is about democratic control of the exercise of government power. And the opposition has many, many responsibilities in terms of holding the government accountable for how they exercise the power that has been vested in them through a democratic process. I look back on my experience not only over the years in opposition, but also over our years in government. I look back to the first year of an NDP government and what was accomplished in one short year, and I contrast that with the accomplishments of this new government in one short year. And I have to say, Mr. Speaker, not surprisingly perhaps, this new government, for me and for the province, falls very short. Mr. Speaker, in the first year of the NDP government, we released to Nova Scotians advice from a panel of preeminent experts with good ideas to start meeting the economic and financial challenges facing the province during our first term in office. We adopted North America's first hard caps on greenhouse gas emission from power generation and Nova Scotia's renewable energy plan. We held the massive province-wide back to balance discussions led by my colleague Graham Steele at the time, creating consensus on many tough financial issues. We refinanced the public sector superannuation plan to put pensions on a sustainable basis while saving tens of millions of dollars each year. We undertook Dr. John Ross's pioneering work, visiting every emergency department and then launching Canada's first provincial emergency care standards, and we made the first real improvements in social assistance income in a generation, introducing the new poverty reduction tax credit and the new affordable living tax credit. And Mr. Speaker, we introduced the first reduction in the small business tax rate in 19 years in this province. So, Mr. Speaker, the government today has given us a throne speech, and as I went through it, my reaction was to think about what needed to be done, to think about all that can be accomplished in a short time, and to think about the work that had previously been done to build on. And frankly, my response to that speech from the throne from yesterday is that this is a government whose ideas are either the recycled ideas of the Liberal government of John Savage in the 1990s, or the ideas of the previous NDP government. There are no ideas in this throne speech that belong to this government on its own. It is something that we, as a province, I think, need to be very concerned about. I think perhaps I heard the Minister of Health say some variations on those ideas, but nevertheless, we have noticed that there is a modification of those old ideas, but nevertheless, they are ideas that have been appropriated, borrowed from others. So, Mr. Speaker, when I look back at many of the things we have accomplished, I feel, as I said, I don't feel bleak about my choice, my involvement in this trade. And I also don't feel bleak or disappointed in the choice I made of political party. My experience tells me that politics can and does work, that there is a difference, in fact, among the political parties. And if there's any doubt in my mind, back home in Halifax, Needham, if we ever wonder what we accomplished in government, we have no further to look, Mr. Speaker, than toward the harbour. I'm particularly proud of the fact that the newest and most advanced shipyard in the world is being built right there. It's the largest structure under construction in Nova Scotia. More than 500 people are working there on this construction because the NDP believed in this province's future enough to partner in a bid to ensure that ships start here. And Mr. Speaker, this brings me again to this current government. A year ago today, it was reported that the now Premier asserted that no provincial investment was necessary in the Ship Start Here project because financing could be arranged after the shipbuilding contract was awarded. Do you remember that, Mr. Speaker? Do you remember that statement? It's pretty shocking that the Premier really didn't believe that financing was one of the most important parts of that bid, Mr. Speaker. And I can't imagine that the Premier could ignore the confidential briefings to his own Party caucus about how rock-solid financing had to be in place for a bid to be able to succeed, or what other places, such as the province of Quebec, were trying to do with their own bid in the time frame. We worked very hard, Mr. Speaker, to double-check all elements of that bid financing and to explore the financial options and to ensure that our province's partnership would mean more jobs for Nova Scotians. Mr. Speaker, our party was not prepared to simply subsidize middle to lower wage jobs that can go anywhere and call that a jobs plan. We acted in government just as we had acted in opposition, focusing on the highest value added and the most productive jobs possible. Because Nova Scotians and Nova Scotia have such a long road to economic equality within Canada. And this is another reason, Mr. Speaker, why I feel such pride about my decision to pursue positive change as a part of a political party and caucus. Now, Mr. Speaker, 1 year ago, the 2013 provincial election campaign was well underway. On September 26, 2013, the Liberal leader was sticking to his promise to end provincial investment in jobs, even if it meant that jobs would disappear. That's right, Mr. Speaker. The Liberals promised that jobs would disappear. And Mr. Speaker, this is one promise that the Liberals have kept. Jobs are disappearing, Mr. Speaker. It's just as the Liberals admitted. 9,000 jobs lost in the first Liberal year alone. 9,000 fewer reasons to stay in Nova Scotia. 9,000 more Nova Scotian families with less income to make ends meet. More Nova Scotian communities with a smaller economy and bigger social strain, and even more pressure on the provincial budget with less revenue and greater needs. And the first Liberal year means no major new investments. And there has not been one new job initiative. If opportunity came knocking, Mr. Speaker, it was ignored, because this is a government that promised to make jobs disappear, Mr. Speaker. New investment means new Nova Scotia jobs to replace those that are invariably lost over time. New investment means new opportunity to improve health care, to reduce poverty, to attract and keep young people who will put down roots and make their lives here in Nova Scotia. Yet that one clear Liberal promise means that Nova Scotia will not be a partner in major new investments, Mr. Speaker, and jobs disappear. Mr. Speaker, I know that the Liberals' major pre-election campaign was a fear campaign about investment in jobs. And the fear campaign was a big part of the very negative Liberal ad campaign in the election itself. And even when their ads could not and did not stand up to independent fact check. So letting jobs disappear was the Premier's line in the sand. And if this Premier and this government cared about jobs, cared about young people, cared about families, they would break that promise too, and the sooner the better, Mr. Speaker. Instead of big foreign trips, starting with the 2 overseas trips during the Premier's first 11 months, perhaps this Premier could stay at home and do some work on a plan to get more job creation in this province, Mr. Speaker. We cannot afford to let even more jobs disappear without at least investing in replacements. We cannot abandon even more opportunities. And, Mr. Speaker, I would go so far as to suggest that the Liberal government needs not to be too proud to admit that the NDP was right. Mr. Speaker, it's also clear that this government, this Liberal government, has no direction. Mr. Speaker, I know that...
Order, please. The Honourable Interim Leader of the New Democratic Party has the floor.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I know that people felt that the former Conservative government had used up any ideas and enthusiasm that they originally brought into office, and they were responding to events rather than leading the province. But, Mr. Speaker, today we have a government that is a do-nothing government. It's mainly responding rather than leading because, Mr. Speaker, this is a government that doesn't really stand for anything. They want others to be responsible, to take responsibility, to deal with the issues, to provide the leadership. And, Mr. Speaker, the Ivany report was a godsend to any government that wants to seize the moment and improve the future of Nova Scotia. But this government has run away from the Ivany report, Mr. Speaker. They're running away from the fact that it is now or never for Nova Scotia. Nova Scotia and their children are paying a price already. One look at the books shows that the Liberals have run away from the spending management that brought departmental spending in under budget year after year, so that the NDP added less operating debt than any other first-term government in at least 50 years, despite the Great Recession. Mr. Speaker, I have said previously that in government, the NDP did too much. And the list of NDP accomplishments is far too long for anyone to remember, much less communicate. But, Mr. Speaker, the Liberals seem to think the lesson that they are better off to do little or nothing. It seems they intend to just manage the news and then make a show of action shortly before the next election. Any battle will be one the Liberals think they can easily win, forgetting the consequences. Mr. Speaker, the time for action on our economy is now. And the action needs to be taken and it needs to be sustained. There is no sense of now or never when the first Liberal budget cranked up spending and the biggest deficit in more than a decade with departmental spending out of control. There was no sense of now or never when the single biggest financial decision this government has made was to eliminate incentives for skilled, well-educated young people to stay and work in Nova Scotia. Just this week, Canadians were told that a big inequality gap is in front of us by age, on top of the gender gap. When they expected to win the election, the Liberals didn't say they were going to kick these underpaid young people right in the pocketbook. But that is exactly what the Liberals did, Mr. Speaker. The graduate retention rebate was targeted precisely at the people Nova Scotia most want to attract and keep. Yet it was cancelled, and the money was not reinvested in the retention of skilled young workers. And Mr. Speaker, immigration is important, but a larger population target is all those young people whose retention rebate was a good extra reason to stay and put down roots in Nova Scotia. Mr. Speaker, this amounts to taking young people for granted, even when they are the most mobile part of our population and their skills are needed here. There is no sense of now or never in the Liberal government's replay of the old 1990s battles with nurses and other healthcare workers and other public services servants. The province's finances are nearly $1 billion worse now than they were a year ago, mainly due to Liberal decisions. And this is no time for quick fixes that have proven to be long-term problems. I don't know, Mr. Speaker, if you remember, but I certainly remember the hiring fairs for Nova Scotian nurses that began to flourish here after Liberal wage restraint and blatant disrespect for the frontline workers in healthcare and other public services. Mr. Speaker, let's not go back there. I spoke recently with janitors, orderlies, cooks, and others whose work is vital to the operation of our hospitals, but whose pay is not exactly magnificent. They live paycheck to paycheck. They and their families will be the first victim of the idea that once again, the big thing is to freeze wages, limit benefits, and start racing to the bottom. I know that it is much harder to direct spending away from ineffective programs. It took more than a year to prepare the long-term analysis of ineffective spending that was already done when this government took office and when this government largely ignored it. My colleagues and I knew that it was now or never to maintain the momentum of good spending control and better use of the people's money which we had started. And a detailed plan to streamline administration and overhead in the health system was ready to move into implementation. And many in the health system had contributed their ideas. Yet its significant savings were shelved. The Liberals would rather spend money on governance changes than save money by actually improving the delivery of hospital-based services. It's a fool's errand to go after wage freezes and severe wage restraints or impositions of collective agreements, avoiding necessary decisions that improve the fundamentals of government. The political will should be focused on redirecting government toward new and important priorities, like early needs plans, the affordable housing strategy, resuming the reduction in poverty, and the direction that was put to put people first in support for seniors and people with disabilities. Mr. Speaker, there were some good ideas in the Liberal platform, and the government has implemented a number of them. But I do wonder, Mr. Speaker, what this Liberal government would do if they couldn't use the ideas that had been built into the provision of government services from the previous NDP government or the old 1990s Liberal ideas. In 1 week alone in April, Mr. Speaker, this government got front page coverage for opening the collaborative clinic in Bridgewater that Premier Dexter had announced as part of the NDP push to increase collaborative care. It got headlines the previous day for introducing legislation to create the apprenticeship agency that had been introduced by my colleague, the member for Cape Breton Centre, who made it his priority to engage in labor and management in fixing apprenticeships. And a few days before that, Mr. Speaker, Cabinet ministers made the news by opening the model early years centres for early childhood education that had been planned and announced by Nova Scotia's first Minister of Education and Early Childhood Development, Ramona Jennings. And Mr. Speaker, whose record let this Premier go to China and boast about Nova Scotia as a clean energy province? Without the NDP record of action and achievement, he would have been stuck with the unkept promises and goals without strategies that came to characterize the Conservative government's approach. Mr. Speaker, perhaps the Liberals are simply stalling until after the federal election because they would rather help federal candidates, Liberal candidates, even if it means the Liberals let Nova Scotia fall further behind financially, economically, and socially. Mr. Speaker, by the time that federal election is over, this government will have used up half its mandate, and the most valuable time to maintain or build momentum toward the goals set forth in the Ivany Report. Mr. Speaker, I know that Nova Scotia can be a national leader and a world leader because I was here when CECs were developed as an innovative way to develop healthcare to smaller communities. And I was here when the community feed-in tariff provided a new model for any country in the world to increase its renewable energy portfolio while building stronger communities. And Mr. Speaker, it was my privilege to be here when the mental health strategy was launched as the first funded strategy in many years, while it delivered exactly what the government promised because government added funding to its fiscal plan as part of adopting this strategy. So, Mr. Speaker, while some may scorn politics, they do so at Nova Scotia's peril, because it is through the political process that provincial direction is set or not set, as the case may be. It is through the political parties that there is accountability for promises broken, for errors and omissions that have real consequences in everyday life. Mr. Speaker, I go out and speak with many, many different groups and organizations around our province, and I am not blinded to the kind of disillusionment that characterizes a lot of the discussion around representative democracy and electoral politics. But, Mr. Speaker, the practice of politics may have its bleak moments of opportunism, of betrayal, of deception, of private gain over the public good. But, Mr. Speaker, it has many, many more times of providing for the public good. And one of the things that I say to people as I meet with them, a line I've stolen from that Massachusetts Democratic Senator, Elizabeth Warren, who's gaining so much attention south of the border. Mr. Speaker, people need to understand that if you're not at the table, you're probably on the menu. And Mr. Speaker, this is why what we do in this House of Assembly is so important. This is why the representation of the people who sent us here is so important. Mr. Speaker, what we do here is not about us. It's about the people outside of this chamber who put their faith and their trust in their representatives to do the best job we can with the hand that we're dealt and the circumstances of the time in which we do our work. Mr. Speaker, I can think of no greater privilege than to have been in this chamber, to be in this chamber, to have been offered this opportunity, Mr. Speaker. And I want to say to my constituents, to the people who supported me to come here, from the bottom of my heart, thank you so much. It has been my privilege to serve, and I will do my best to continue to do that as long as you wish for me to be in this place. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.